The first burst caught nothing, just trees, mud, October fog hanging in the ravine like wet cotton. Major Paul Vollmer's machine gun crews on the ridge above Hill 223 had opened on movement below, American infantry pushing through the Argonne brush in a scattered line, and the initial exchange felt routine. His men held elevated positions, interlocking fields of fire. The Americans had walked into a pocket, and Vollmer's gunners knew their business. 17 of them went down in the first seconds. The patrol's officers crumpled. What remained of the American element dove for cover behind a knoll of earth and deadfall timber, dragging German prisoners they'd stumbled into moments earlier. From Vollmer's position, the fight looked finished. Then his machine gunners started dying, one at a time. No pattern Vollmer could read. A gunner would slump off his weapon, and before the assistant could take over, he'd drop too. The shots came from somewhere in the brush below the ridge, single deliberate reports spaced apart like a man counting between each one. Not suppressive fire, not a Browning automatic rifle hosing the tree line. Individual aimed shots, and every one of them landed. If you're watching this and you know a detail I missed, or you think I got something wrong, drop it in the comments. Hit like, subscribe, and stick around, because this story gets stranger than the cold open. Vollmer sent a squad down the hill to flank the position. 6 men. They worked through the undergrowth with fixed bayonets, closing on what they assumed had to be a cluster of riflemen. The fire kept coming from the same spot, same rhythm, unhurried. A German lieutenant who survived the assault described the sound as hunting fire, the kind of shooting a man does when he has time and knows where every target will appear before it appears. The flanking squad charged. 5 of them fell in a space Vollmer later estimated at 25 yards. The 6th surrendered. The shooting did not stop. Vollmer had fought Americans before. He understood their artillery, feared their abundance of ammunition, respected the Springfield rifle as a weapon. What he could not process, what no part of his 4 years on the Western Front had prepared him for, was the accuracy. Not from a sniper in a prepared hide with a scoped rifle and a spotter. From a man in the open, kneeling in brush, working a bolt with his bare hands, while prisoners milled around him and wounded men groaned at his feet. The major could see muzzle flash now. One position, one rifle. He counted his dead and revised the situation downward. The German doctrine for breaking this kind of engagement called for volume. Concentrate fire on the position, suppress it, maneuver under that suppression. Vollmer ordered exactly this. His remaining gunners traversed toward the muzzle flash. The Americans shifted targets to each gun as it swung, killing the gunner before the barrel settled. One account from a surviving NCO on Vollmer's ridge noted something peculiar. The Americans shot the rearmost targets first in each group, then worked forward. The men in front never saw the men behind them fall. They kept advancing into what they believed remained a squad-sized element until they reached the brush and found one red-headed man with a rifle, a pistol, and a circle of German dead around him, like spokes on a wheel. His name, though Vollmer did not learn it until later that afternoon, when he unbuckled his own sidearm and handed it over, carried no weight in any army on earth. Private Alvin Cullum York, from Pall Mall, Tennessee, 29 years old, a conscientious objector who had tried not to come to France at all. By the time Vollmer surrendered himself and the remnants of his command, York and the 7 unwounded Americans still with him walked 132 German prisoners back to the American lines. York's rifle, a M1917 Enfield, had jammed repeatedly throughout the engagement. During one of those jams, 6 Germans rushed him with bayonets. He drew his M1911 pistol and dropped all 6 back to front, so the men in the lead would not see the men behind them falling and hit the ground. Turkey hunters from Tennessee shoot the rearmost bird in a flock first, same reason. The Argonne Forest runs roughly 20 miles north to south between the Erie River and the ridge country west of the Meuse. In October 1918, it looked like something designed by a committee of German engineers who hated infantry. Steep ravines cut east to west across the American axis of advance, each one a natural kill zone. The undergrowth grew so thick in places that a man could not see 10 feet in front of him. The canopy blocked aerial observation. The floor stayed wet, a permanent carpet of rotting leaves that sucked at boots and swallowed the dead. The Germans had held this ground for 4 years. They knew every draw, every reverse slope, every spot where fog pooled at dawn. Here is what they built. The Kriemhilde Stellung, the central belt of the Hindenburg Line running through the Argonne sector, stacked 3 defensive bands across a depth of roughly 15 kilometers. The forward zone held outposts and wire. The main battle zone behind it contained the machine gun nests, dug into hillsides with overhead timber cover, positioned so that each nest's beaten zone overlapped the next. A battalion attacking one nest would walk into enfilading fire from 2 others it could not see. The reserve zone held artillery pre-registered on every approach the Americans might use, with telephone lines buried 6 feet underground, so shellfire could not cut communications between the guns and the observers who directed them. So why did German officers feel confident? Because this system had already chewed up the French, repeatedly. The Argonne had consumed entire divisions in 1915, grinding them into the forest floor for gains measured in hundreds of meters. The German defensive philosophy by 1918 had evolved past holding a rigid line. They held a web. You could punch through one strand, and the web flexed, absorbed you, closed behind you, and killed you from 3 directions, while you stood in the gap, wondering why the position you'd just captured felt worse than the one you'd left. Vollmer's sector on Hill 223 sat inside this web. His machine gun companies occupied prepared positions with pre-cut fields of fire, ammunition stockpiled in buried bunkers, and withdrawal routes marked with white tape so gunners could fall back to secondary positions in darkness. The Maxim 08 guns his crews operated fired at a cyclic rate of roughly 450 rounds per minute. Each gun required a 4-man crew, gunner, assistant, 2 ammunition carriers, and Vollmer had enough guns on that ridge to put over 3,000 rounds per minute into the ravine below. The smell up there, according to one German account from the sector, hung between cordite and wet earth, with something sweeter underneath that no one talked about. The forest had been fought over long enough that the ground itself carried the dead from previous seasons. Against this system, the American Expeditionary Force threw divisions that had existed for less than a year. The 82nd Division, York's outfit, the All-American, had trained at Camp Gordon, Georgia, sailed to France, and received its first serious combat instruction from French and British officers who regarded the Americans with a mix of relief and condescension. The doughboys arrived eager and physically strong and largely ignorant of what interlocking machine gun fire did to men moving through dense forest. French liaison officers attached to American units during the Meuse Argonne recorded their alarm at the tactical naivety of some battalion commanders, who ordered frontal assaults across open ground that a 1915 poilu would have refused. The first 3 days of the offensive, launched September 26th, confirmed every German assumption. American units advanced into the web and bled. The 35th Division lost so many officers that companies operated under sergeants. The 79th Division, attacking Montfaucon, stalled for 2 days against a position the pre-war French General Staff had estimated would fall in 3 hours. Traffic jams clogged the roads behind the front so badly that ammunition could not reach forward units, and wounded men lay in aid stations without morphine because the medical wagons sat bumper to bumper on a single muddy track south of Auvercourt. The Germans watched this and drew a reasonable conclusion. The Americans had numbers, courage, industrial weight behind them. They did not have the tactical sophistication to break a prepared defense in depth. Then, a patrol from the 82nd Division's 328th Infantry Regiment walked into a ravine below Hill 223, and a red-headed private from Tennessee started doing something no German defensive calculus had accounted for. The Wolf River runs copper-brown through Fentress County in summer, cold enough to numb a hand in 4 seconds. York grew up on its banks in a 3-room cabin with 10 siblings, a father who blacksmithed when sober and fought when drunk, and a mother who read scripture by firelight because the valley had no electricity. Pall Mall sat in a fold of the Cumberland Plateau, so remote that the nearest railroad stop required a full day's ride on a mule. The soil grew corn if you worked it hard, and broke your back if you didn't, and either way, you stayed poor. York learned to shoot the way everyone in that valley learned to shoot, because food depended on it. Squirrel at 40 yards with a muzzle-loading rifle his father handed him at age 6. The technique mattered more than the weapon. A squirrel hit in the body ruins the meat. You shoot for the head, or you bark the squirrel. Place the round into the bark directly beneath it, so the concussion knocks it off the branch without tearing the hide. At 6, with a muzzle loader that weighed almost as much as he did. By the time York reached adulthood, he competed in turkey shoots across 3 counties and won so consistently that organizers started handicapping him, moving his position back or requiring offhand shots that other competitors took from a rest. He shot in wind, in rain, in fading light, and in freezing cold. The rifle changed. His family eventually acquired a bolt action, but the fundamentals never shifted. Front sight, breath control, trigger squeeze, follow through. Every round aimed and every round accountable. A missed shot meant a missed meal, and the York family could not afford to miss meals. So when his draft notice arrived in June 1917, York filed for conscientious objector status. His church, the Church of Christ in Christian Union, a small congregation rooted in the holiness movement, taught that killing violated the commandments absolutely. York believed this with the same plainness he believed the sun rose. He filled out the paperwork. The draft board in Jamestown denied it. The Church of Christ in Christian Union did not appear on the War Department's list of recognized pacifist denominations. That list included Quakers, Mennonites, Brethren. A backwoods holiness church in Fentress County, Tennessee, did not qualify. York appealed, denied again. He reported to Camp Gordon in November 1917, carrying a Bible and a conviction that God did not want him to kill, assigned to a division full of draftees from every state in the Union. The reason the 82nd earned its nickname. What happened next at Camp Gordon depends on whose account you trust. York's own diary, written in a spelling so creative that editors later cleaned it up beyond recognition. Records-long conversations with his battalion commander, Major George Edward Buxton, and his company commander, Captain Edward Courtney Bullock Danforth. Both officers took York's objection seriously. Buxton, himself a committed Christian, sat with York over multiple evenings and walked through Scripture. The book of Ezekiel, Romans 13. Buxton did not order York to abandon his beliefs. He argued, pastor to believer, that a just war permitted righteous violence. York listened, prayed, went home on leave for 10 days, climbed a mountain above Pall Mall, and came back down ready to fight. His diary records no blinding revelation. Acetylene is the best way to describe it. 2 contradictions had found a place to coexist inside him, and he stopped waiting for one to win. The Army, meanwhile, discovered what it had in York's marksmanship scores. The qualification course at Camp Gordon used iron-sighted Springfield .03s at ranges from 200 to 600 yards. York shot expert on his first attempt with a score high enough that his company commander noted it in a report. The other draftees in his platoon, city boys from Ohio, factory workers from New Jersey, farm kids from Georgia who thought they could shoot, watched York on the range and stopped talking about their own scores. The Springfield's bolt threw differently than the rifles York had grown up with. Heavier pull, sharper lock time. He adapted inside a week. The M1917 Enfield he carried into the Argonne handled differently still. A cock-on closing bolt that felt sluggish compared to the Springfield. York never complained about it. A man who learned marksmanship on a muzzle-loader does not get particular about bolt actions. He sailed for France in May 1918, carrying both the rifle and the contradiction. Not a German's words this time. Sergeant Bernard Early, leading the patrol that morning, told investigators afterward that the fog sat so low in the ravine he could not see his own feet. October 8, 1918. 6:10 a.m., or close to it. The after-action reports conflict by 15 minutes. 17 men from Company G, 328th Infantry, dropped into a draw north of Châtel-Chehery, with orders to infiltrate behind the German main line of resistance and knock out machine gun positions that had stalled the battalion's advance for 2 days. The patrol included 3 NCOs, Early, Corporal Murray Savage, Corporal York, and 14 privates carrying Enfields, bayonets, wire cutters, and no automatic weapons. No grenades either, according to York's account. Whether this reflected supply shortages or a deliberate choice for a stealth patrol, the records do not say. They moved in a loose file through brush so dense that the man 5 positions back in the column navigated by sound alone, following the crack of branches ahead of him because he could not see the man breaking them. The route took them west, then north, looping around the German flank through a stretch of forest the 82nd's intelligence section believed lightly held. That assessment drew on aerial photographs taken 3 days earlier. 3 days in the Argonne meant nothing. German units rotated positions nightly, carried their Maxims on their backs like furniture, and rebuilt nests in hours using pre-cut timber stacked at supply points throughout the forest. The photographs showed empty clearings. The clearings had filled. Early's patrol crossed a small stream, likely a tributary of the Aire, though no one in the group recorded its name, and climbed the far bank into a shallow bowl of ground, backed by a ridge running roughly east-west. They heard voices. German voices, casual, the sound of men eating breakfast near a field kitchen. The patrol had walked directly into the rear area of a German battalion headquarters element. Officers, runners, telephonists, a handful of signal troops, a cluster of enlisted men gathered around 2 portable stoves. The smell of ersatz coffee cut through the fog. The whole thing took less than 10 seconds. Early's men rushed the position. The Germans, surprised, unarmed, or with rifles stacked beyond reach, threw up their hands. A major among them, later identified as part of the 1st Battalion, 120th Landwehr, surrendered immediately. The Americans had stumbled into a gift, a headquarters element with maps, communication equipment, officers who knew the disposition of every gun on the ridge above. York and the other corporals began organizing the prisoners into a group while Early counted heads. Roughly 70 Germans stood with their hands raised in that shallow bowl of ground, stunned and compliant, their war apparently over. The ridge opened up. The machine guns above them, Vollmer's guns, sighted on Hill 223 with beaten zones pre-registered across exactly this kind of dead ground, fired directly into the bowl. The gunners on the ridge could see Americans and Germans tangled together below, and they fired anyway. The first burst killed Germans and Americans indiscriminately. 6 of Early's 17 men dropped. Early himself took rounds through the arm and body. Corporal Savage fell dead. Privates Demowski, Weiler, Swanson, Wine, Waring. The similarity of those last 2 names has confused historians for a century, and the company roster does not help, went down in a heap. The survivors flattened themselves behind the German prisoners, who were screaming, diving, crawling over each other in the mud. One German officer among the captives shouted up at the ridge to cease fire. The guns did not stop. York found himself on the left flank of what remained. The knoll of earth between him and the ridge offered partial cover, enough to keep the direct grazing fire off his position, not enough to stop plunging fire if the gunners adjusted elevation. He could see the muzzle flashes above him. 9 guns, maybe more, spitting tracers that clipped branches and threw splinters of wet wood across the bowl like shrapnel. The prisoners around him pressed flat against the ground. The surviving Americans could not move, could not retreat back across the stream without exposing themselves to those interlocking fires for 100 yards of open brush. Early, bleeding from multiple wounds, could no longer command. Savage lay face down in the mud. The privates looked at each other across a space filled with noise and German screaming, smoke hanging in the wet air. York raised his Enfield. Why didn't they just shoot him? That question has irritated military historians for a century, and the answer sits in the geometry of a Maxim 08 on a fixed tripod. The gun's traverse depended on a T-shaped mechanism that allowed roughly a 60-degree arc. Vollmer's crews had their guns sighted downhill into the bowl and along the ravine approaches, the directions an attack would come from. York lay below them and to the left, tucked against a knoll at an angle that put him outside the beaten zone of at least 5 of the 9 guns. The crews that could see him had to physically lift the gun's tail, repin the traversing mechanism, and relay on a single prone figure, partially hidden by brush and prisoners. A Maxim on a sled mount weighs over 60 pounds without water in the jacket. Repositioning one under fire takes 2 men and about 20 seconds. York did not give them 20 seconds. He fired from a prone position, working the Enfield's bolt with a mechanical smoothness drilled in across 10,000 repetitions. The range to the nearest gun was somewhere between 200 and 300 yards. Sources conflict, and York himself gave different estimates at different times. The fog had thinned slightly as the morning warmed, enough to see muzzle flashes clearly, but not enough to give the German gunners a crisp sight picture of a single man lying in mud-colored wool against mud-colored earth. York could see them fine. They stood or crouched behind their guns, silhouetted against the sky on the ridge above him, backlit by the pale October overcast, a turkey on a fence rail. Every round he fired the way his father taught him at 6 years old on the Wolf River, front sight centered, breath released halfway, squeeze through the brake, follow through held until the sight picture settled again. The Enfield held 5 rounds in its magazine. He fired 5, reloaded from a stripper clip, fired 5 more. The brass casings ejected hot against his right hand and disappeared into the wet leaves beneath him. He could feel each one land, a small bright point of heat against the cold of everything else. The turkey shoot technique showed itself in the sequence. York did not shoot the nearest gunner on each Maxim crew. He shot the farthest one first, the ammunition carrier at the back of the 4-man team, then the next man forward, then the next. A flock of turkeys will scatter if the lead bird drops. Shoot the rear bird, and the others keep walking, unaware, because the danger happened behind them where they weren't looking. A Maxim crew focused on feeding belts and traversing their gun did not immediately register that their rearmost man had slumped over, not when the noise of their own weapon blanked out the sound of an Enfield firing 200 yards below them. The assistant gunner turned his head when the second ammunition carrier fell. By then, York had already shifted to the next crew. The German gun went silent, not because the gunner died, but because no one fed the belt and the gun stuttered dry. Then the gunner looked back, and York shot him too. 1 gun went quiet, then 2 more in quick succession. Each Maxim that stopped firing reduced the volume of fire into the bowl by 450 rounds per minute, which meant the surviving Americans and the German prisoners could press a little less flat, breathe a little deeper. York worked left to right across the ridge, the direction that kept each successive target on his natural point of aim without major repositioning. A right-handed prone shooter pivoting on his left elbow moves most efficiently in that direction. Whether York thought about this consciously or simply followed the body mechanics drilled into him across a lifetime of shooting, unknown. The effect looked the same from the ridge. Guns fell silent in sequence, left to right, as if someone had run a finger across piano keys and muted each one. German after-action reporting from the 120th Landwehr for October 8th contains no specific mention of a single shooter neutralizing the ridge guns. The unit's records for that day are fragmentary. The battalion lost its headquarters element, its maps, most of its communication equipment, all in that first rush by Early's patrol. What survives are casualty figures and a terse notation that multiple machine gun positions ceased functioning during the morning engagement. The bureaucratic language covers something the clerks who wrote it probably could not explain. York emptied his Enfield, reloaded, emptied it again. Somewhere around his 20th round, the bolt stuck. The M1911 sat in a flap holster on York's right hip, hammer down on a loaded chamber, 7 rounds of .45 ACP in the magazine. Officers carried them as standard issue. NCOs and enlisted men did not, but York had acquired one somewhere before the Argonne, and the records offer no explanation of how. A pistol meant for close quarters, designed by John Browning for stopping Moro juramentados in the Philippines, who kept charging through 38 revolver rounds. The Army wanted a handgun that put a man on the ground with 1 hit. Browning gave them a 230-grain bullet, moving at 850 feet per second, a slow fat round that transferred its energy into flesh instead of punching through it. The gun kicked like a mule and pointed like a finger. York needed it now, because 6 Germans had left their trench on the ridge and come downhill with bayonets. The charge made tactical sense, the only sense left. The Maxim crews, still functioning, could see their guns going quiet one by one, could hear the methodical crack of a rifle below them, picking off gunners they could not replace fast enough. A lieutenant, York described him later as an officer, and German doctrine placed junior officers at the squad level in exactly these situations, gathered 5 men and led them over the lip of the position in a rush straight down the slope toward the knoll where York lay. 200 yards of broken ground, steep enough that a running man picks up speed whether he wants to or not. They came through the brush with fixed bayonets on Gewehr 98s, screaming something York could not make out over the noise. The Enfield's bolt had jammed on a deformed casing. The extractor had torn through the rim, leaving the brass wedged in the chamber. York set the rifle down. He drew the pistol. He shot the last man in the charging line first, then the 5th, then the 4th. The technique transferred perfectly from turkeys to bayonets. Kill the rear man, and the men ahead of him do not see him fall because they are running forward, focused on the target, adrenaline narrowing their vision to the single point where their bayonet will meet the American's body. The 6th man dropped and the 5th man did not notice because the 5th man had 2 seconds left to live. York fired with the pistol extended in one hand, his body still prone or barely raised behind the knoll, the .45 bucking in his grip and resettling on the next target downhill. The geometry favored him grotesquely. The Germans ran in a rough file on the narrow slope, each man's body fully exposed, closing range with every stride. At 100 yards, a .45 hits like a freight car. At 50 yards, it does not matter where the round lands. The 3rd man stumbled over the 4th man's body, and York shot him as he tried to rise. The 2nd man stopped running. The first moment any of them understood what had happened behind them, and York shot him standing still. The lieutenant, leading from the front as German officers did, turned his head at the sound of the 5th body hitting the ground and caught the last round in the pistol's magazine somewhere in the chest. He folded forward onto the slope and slid a few feet downhill in the mud, his bayonet digging a furrow in the wet earth. 7 rounds, 6 men. York missed once. The slope went quiet for a beat that felt, according to York, like the longest pause of his life. The remaining Maxims had stopped firing, not because their crews were dead, but because they had watched 6 men charge downhill and none of them get close enough to use a bayonet. The fog carried the smell of cordite and something copper-sweet underneath it. York's hand ached from the pistol's recoil. His ears rang at a frequency that made the forest sound like it existed underwater. Lieutenant Paul Jürgen Vollmer, commanding the machine gun company on the ridge, stood up from behind his position and called down in English. He offered to surrender. York shouted back. In his diary, he records only that he told Vollmer to come down and bring his men. Vollmer did. He walked down the slope past the 6 bodies of his own bayonet charge, past the silent Maxims, past gun crews who set down their belts and raised their hands, because the officer they answered to had decided that whatever this American rifleman represented, it could not be stopped by anything left on that hill. York reloaded the pistol and began collecting prisoners. Vollmer did not surrender because he ran out of men. He surrendered because he ran out of explanations. The German officer had spent 4 years on the Western Front. He spoke English because he had lived in the United States before the war. Sources disagree on whether he attended school in Chicago or worked there, and Vollmer himself gave conflicting accounts in captivity. What mattered in that ravine was simpler. He could communicate directly with the man who had just killed a bayonet charge using a pistol and a turkey hunting technique from rural Tennessee. Vollmer walked down the slope with his hands visible, not raised fully but open at his sides, palms forward. Behind him, gun crews stood up from positions they had held all morning. Some left their Maxims mid-belt. Others had already abandoned their guns minutes earlier, crouching below the lip of the ridge where York's Enfield rounds could not find them, waiting for someone to tell them what came next. York had 7 surviving Americans. He had somewhere between 70 and 90 German prisoners, already sitting in the bowl from the original headquarters capture. Now Vollmer brought down his machine gun company, crews, ammunition bearers, the remnants of the infantry squads attached to the position. The number climbed past 100. York told Vollmer to line his men up in a column of twos and start marching south, back toward the American lines. Vollmer complied. He also did something that York recorded with what reads like surprise in his diary. Vollmer personally instructed the remaining German positions along the route to surrender as the column passed. York had placed Vollmer at the front of the column with the pistol pressed against the German's back. Not cruelty, arithmetic. A single American with 7 wounded or shaken men could not guard 100+ prisoners on a mile-long march through forest still held by German units. The pistol against Vollmer's spine converted the German officer into York's instrument of safe passage. Every pocket of resistance they encountered, Vollmer called out in German, identified himself by rank and unit, and ordered the men to lay down their weapons and join the column. The column grew like a river picking up tributaries. A squad here, a listening post there, a pair of runners caught between positions, a lone sentry standing in a foxhole with nowhere to go. Each group that joined added bodies to the prisoner count and reduced the number of armed Germans between York and safety. The math worked in York's favor with every step south, and Vollmer, who understood this math perfectly, kept calling out surrenders because stopping meant the pistol, and running meant the pistol, and the man holding it had already demonstrated that he did not miss at ranges far greater than the distance between his hand and Vollmer's back. They reached the American lines sometime before noon. The exact time, again, conflicts between sources. What does not conflict is the reaction. Brigadier General Julian Lindsay, commanding the 82nd Infantry Brigade, saw York march in with his column and initially assumed the red-headed corporal had captured a small patrol. Then, the column kept coming. Prisoners filed past the American positions in pairs, helmets off, hands up or clasped behind their heads, their Feldgrau tunics dark with rain and sweat. Lindsay watched them pass and started counting. The count reached 100, and he sent for his adjutant. It passed 120, and he sent for the division commander. The final tally, confirmed by the Provost Marshal's office after processing, 132 prisoners, including 4 officers. York's patrol had also silenced 35 machine guns on the ridge. The number comes from the 82nd Division's after-action report, which someone on the staff clearly wrote with a sense that no one would believe it. Lindsay asked York how many men he had. 7, sir. The rest are dead or wounded back in the ravine. That exchange appears in multiple accounts with minor variations. Lindsay's response does not survive in direct quotation, but division records note that he recommended York for the Medal of Honor within hours, before the prisoner processing had even finished. Vollmer, for his part, said almost nothing during processing. A captured German officer surrounded by 131 of his own men, all of them taken by a force of 8 Americans, led by a corporal from Pall Mall, Tennessee, who had filed for conscientious objector status 11 months earlier. The German military system that produced Vollmer had no category for what had happened to him, no doctrine that accounted for it, no training that prepared for it. No army in Europe has a culture of marksmanship that begins in childhood, because no army in Europe draws from a population that owns its own rifles. A German officer named Fritz Endres wrote that line in a post-war assessment prepared for the U.S. Army Historical Division, and the sentence carries the weight of a man who spent 4 years watching his own soldiers die and needed to explain why. Endres served in the Argonne, not in Vollmer's unit, but close enough, the 210th Reserve Infantry Regiment, positioned less than 3 kilometers east of Hill 223. His FMS report, filed in 1946, addressed American infantry effectiveness during the Meuse Argonne with a clinical detachment that cracks in places. He described American rifle fire as accurate beyond any reasonable expectation for conscript soldiers, then corrected himself in the next paragraph. They were not conscripts in the European sense. They were volunteers and draftees who had handled firearms since boyhood, who understood trajectory and windage and trigger discipline not as military skills, but as household competencies. the way a German farmer's son understood a plow. The American private arrived at training camp already a marksman. The army merely gave him a target. This distinction mattered enormously, and European military establishments never fully absorbed it. The Prussian system produced superb soldiers through institutional discipline, drill, repetition, obedience, the manufactured precision of a state apparatus designed to turn peasants into riflemen in 18 months. The American system skipped the first 12 months because the raw material came pre-shaped. A boy from Fentress County who killed squirrels with a muzzleloader at 50 yards before he could read did not need the army to teach him how to shoot. He needed the army to teach him where to stand while he did it. The broader German assessment of the Meuse-Argonne collapse, assembled across dozens of FMS reports between 1945 and 1959, returns obsessively to two themes: American artillery and American logistics. The sheer density of shells falling on German positions during the final weeks of the offensive exceeded anything the Western Front had produced, including Verdun. German officers described barrages that lasted for hours without pause, fed by ammunition dumps that seemed inexhaustible, directed by forward observers who corrected fire with a speed that suggested telephone communication the German signal corps could not match or intercept. Behind the guns, the roads stayed open. Trucks moved, supplies arrived, wounded went rearward in ambulances. The machine kept running. York barely appears in these institutional assessments. One man with a rifle does not register in the organizational memory of an army that lost the war to factories and railheads. But the individual German accounts, the memoirs, the letters home from prisoner of war camps in places like Camp Oglethorpe and Fort Sam Houston, those tell a different story. Captured NCOs described American marksmanship with a bafflement that reads like grief. One sergeant from the 210th, interviewed at a processing center in Chaumont, told his interrogator that he had fought against British, French, Belgian, and American troops across 4 years, and only the Americans shot as if every bullet cost them something personal. The phrase in the original German report translates roughly as each shot placed like a signature. York went home to Tennessee in 1919. He turned down every commercial offer, vaudeville tours, movie deals, product endorsements for over 20 years. He used his Medal of Honor celebrity to build a school in Fentress County because the valley still had no proper one. The York Agricultural Institute opened in 1926, funded by donations York solicited personally, on land he helped clear with his own hands. Vollmer went home to Germany. He survived the Second World War. In 1964, the two men exchanged letters, York in failing health, Vollmer elderly, and living quietly in a country that had been rebuilt twice. The content of those letters remains private, held by the York family. What passed between a German officer and the Tennessee marksman who held a pistol to his spine across a mile of French forest belongs to them. Here is what the German system could not replicate and could not defeat: a country where 10 million boys grew up shooting. Not soldiers, boys. The army collected them, fed them, shipped them to France, and pointed them at the ridgeline. The rest took care of itself. York fired his Enfield the way he breathed, automatically, with no effort and no institutional teaching that a European military academy could identify or reproduce. The skill lived in his hands before the uniform touched his shoulders. What did the German army do with the lesson? They studied it, meticulously, the way Germans study everything that kills them. Between the wars, Reichswehr training manuals expanded marksmanship programs, added individual field firing exercises, emphasized aimed rifle fire at ranges the Imperial Army had considered the exclusive province of machine guns. The Wehrmacht that invaded Poland in 1939 carried better optics, better training ammunition budgets, better range estimation drills, better field glasses for NCOs than the army York had fought in the Argonne. They had read the after-action reports. They knew about the American riflemen. They built a force designed in part to never be embarrassed by one again. 21 years later, that force met a different set of Americans in the hedgerows of Normandy and the frozen forests of the Hurtgen. And the problem had gotten worse. The boys from Fentress County had multiplied. The civilian marksmanship program, established in 1903, had spent 4 decades distributing surplus rifles to shooting clubs across the country. The national matches at Camp Perry, Ohio, drew thousands of competitors annually, farmers, clerks, college students, factory workers, who fired service rifles at 300, 600, and 1,000 yards for trophies that cost the government almost nothing and produced a civilian population with long-range shooting skills no European conscription system could match. By 1941, an estimated 4 million Americans participated in organized competitive shooting. The number who hunted dwarfed even that. The War Department's own estimates put civilian firearms ownership above 30 million weapons. The draft merely collected what the culture had already built. German soldiers in Normandy reported the same phenomenon Endres had documented in 1918. Rifle fire of abnormal accuracy from what should have been green troops. An FMS report by General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer-Lehr Division during the breakout from the Bocage, noted that American infantry replaced casualties without any observable decline in small arms effectiveness. The phrase he used translates as the replacements shot, as well as the men they replaced. Bayerlein found this inexplicable. The German replacement system fed half-trained conscripts forward and watched unit quality degrade with every engagement. The American system fed forward men who had grown up with deer rifles in Michigan, shotguns in Alabama, squirrel guns in the Ozarks, varmint guns in West Texas, and the quality held. The Trent Park transcripts capture the frustration raw. A captured Oberst, recorded in late 1944, told a fellow prisoner that German marksmanship training consumed 8 weeks and 400 rounds per recruit. He estimated, bitterly, from the sound of the transcript, that the average American replacement had fired 4,000 rounds before he ever touched an army weapon. The number feels high. The sentiment does not. York himself never fired another shot in combat. His health declined through the 1930s and 40s. The Argonne left him with respiratory damage from gas exposure that the Veterans Administration took decades to acknowledge. He spent his final years in a VA hospital in Nashville, partially paralyzed from a stroke, his fame a half-remembered thing from a war most Americans had replaced with a bigger one. He died in 1964, the same year he exchanged those letters with Vollmer. The IRS had been pursuing him for years over back taxes on income from the 1941 movie he had finally agreed to make. The government he had fought for sent him a tax bill. The school he built still operates. The German answer to the American rifleman. Better training, better doctrine, institutional marksmanship programs redesigned from the ground up, worked on paper, and failed in practice for a reason so simple it borders on comedy. You cannot train a conscript in 8 weeks to match a skill that took 18 years of Saturdays in the woods to build. The Wehrmacht tried. The Cold War Soviet Army tried harder, building the most elaborate competitive shooting infrastructure in history. State-funded from age 12, Olympic medals by the bushel. They produced excellent target shooters. They did not produce a culture where a semi-literate farmer's son from a valley with no electricity could pick up a borrowed pistol and kill 6 men running downhill at him because the motion reminded him of a turkey shoot back home. The Reichswehr's revised marksmanship manual, printed in 1929, devoted 11 pages to American infantry rifle technique. Somewhere in a German archive, that manual sits on a shelf, its spine cracked from use, annotated in pencil by officers who carried it into France in 1940 and spent 4 years learning that reading about the problem and solving it occupied different continents. York's great-grandchildren hunt the same ridges in Fentress County. Squirrels mostly. Turkey season opens in April.